Earl was not a man who startled easily. He had lived alone on his ranch for 11 years, through dry summers and frozen winters, through broken fences and sick horses and long stretches of silence that would have driven other men into town for company. He was comfortable with quiet. He was comfortable with hard work. He was comfortable with the kind of life that asked nothing fancy of a person and gave back exactly what was put in. He woke that Tuesday morning the same way he woke every morning. Before the sun was fully up, boots on, hat on, coffee on the stove. He drank it standing at the window, looking out at the flat gray light spreading slow across the land. The horses would need feeding. The west fence post had been leaning for a week and needed setting straight. There was a loose board on the side of the barn he had been meaning to nail down. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to see his breath. Dead leaves scraped across the dirt in the wind. He walked the familiar path from the house to the barn, the same path he had walked thousands of times, and that was when he noticed the latch. He had latched that door the night before. He always latched it. It was not something he forgot, the same way he never forgot to check the water troughs or bank the stove before sleeping. But the latch was hanging loose, swinging slightly in the morning wind, and along the bottom edge of the barn door there were small scratch marks that had not been there yesterday. Earl stood still for a moment. He looked at the marks. He looked at the ground and found small prints in the soft dirt, narrow and clawed, not like any dog or cat or fox he had ever seen. He rested his hand on the knife at his belt, not drawing it, just resting it there, and pushed the barn door open with his boot. The horses were calm. That was the first thing he checked. His two mares, Roan and the older gray he called Dusty, were standing easy in their stalls, ears soft, eyes half closed. Horses knew when something was wrong before any man did. If they were calm, whatever was in the barn was not a threat, or at least not one they recognized as such. Earl found that more interesting than frightening. He moved through the barn slowly. He checked the feed sacks, undisturbed. He checked the tool wall, everything in place. He looked up at the loft and saw nothing but old hay. Then he moved to the far corner, the dark one where he kept a pile of worn saddle blankets he had not used in years, and he stopped walking. The pile was moving. Not much. Just a slow rise and fall, like breathing, and a small trembling at the edges. Earl crouched down, knees creaking, and reached out and pulled the top blanket back. Underneath were three creatures he had no good word for in the moment he first saw them. They were long and low to the ground, with four short legs and folded wings pressed tight against their bodies. Their scales caught the thin light coming through the barn slats, and each one was a slightly different color, the largest a deep earthy green, the middle one a dull copper brown, and the smallest a pale gray that looked almost silver in certain light. They were tangled together, tails wrapped around each other, heads tucked in close, shivering in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with cold. Then they saw him. All three heads came up at once. 6 eyes, wide and bright and completely still, fixed on his face. Nobody moved. Earl looked at them. They looked at Earl. The wind pushed against the barn wall outside and made the boards groan. The smallest one opened its mouth. What came out was not a roar or a hiss. It was a small, thin tongue of flame, barely the size of a candle, that shot forward and caught the cuff of Earl's sleeve before the creature even seemed to know it had happened. The flame was there and gone in less than a second, leaving a small dark scorch mark on the fabric and the faint smell of burnt wool in the air. Earl looked at his sleeve. He looked back at the small drake. The creature had flattened itself completely against the blanket, wings spread wide and pressed down, head low, making a sound like a tiny kettle losing the last of its steam. It looked, for all the world, like something that was deeply sorry and had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The other two had not moved. The largest one had placed itself slightly in front of the smaller ones, not aggressively, just quietly, the way an older sibling might step forward without thinking. Earl patted out the scorch mark on his sleeve with 2 fingers. He stood up slowly. He walked to the shelf near the barn door where he kept a tin of dried beef strips he had bought for training a pair of dogs that had since moved on with a neighbor's boy. He carried the tin back to the corner and set it on the ground near the blanket pile. Then he filled a wooden bowl from the water barrel and set that down too. He looked at them one more time. The smallest one had lifted its head just slightly, watching him with one eye. Earl turned, walked back to the barn door and latched it carefully behind him. He went inside, poured himself a second cup of coffee, and stood at the window looking out at the barn for a long moment before he got on with the rest of his morning. He told no one. There was no one to tell. Earl did not go back to the barn that first day. He gave them the morning, then the afternoon, then the evening. He did his work the way he always did, fixed the leaning fence post, nailed the loose board, checked the water troughs. He moved around the outside of the barn without going in, and once, just once, he pressed his ear to the wall and listened. There were soft sounds inside. Small movements. The occasional low sound like a rumble that had not quite decided to become a growl. He straightened up and went back to the house. On the second morning he unlatched the barn door, set a fresh tin of dried beef and a bowl of water just inside the entrance, and pulled the door mostly closed again without looking in. He was not sure why he did it that way. It just seemed like the right approach. Some things needed to be given space before they could be approached, and Earl had learned that lesson with horses long before he ever thought it might apply to anything else. On the third morning he pushed the door fully open and walked inside. The saddle blankets in the far corner had been completely rearranged. What had been a loose pile was now a shaped nest, the blankets pulled and folded and packed into a low round structure that looked surprisingly deliberate. The hay from the corner had been drawn in around the outside of it like a wall. Whoever had built it had done so with some clear idea of what they were making. Both food tins were completely empty. The water bowl had been moved to the edge of the nest and was empty too. All three drakes were inside the nest, watching him arrive. The largest one lifted its head and made a low sound in its chest. Not threatening. More like an acknowledgement. Earl nodded at it the way he might nod at a neighbor he passed on the road and went about his business checking the horses. Roan stamped once and tossed her head in the direction of the nest. Dusty ignored the whole situation entirely, which Earl respected. He refilled the food tin and the water bowl and left without ceremony. This became the routine. Every morning Earl came in, refilled what was empty, checked the horses and left. Every morning the drakes watched him come and go without moving from their nest. By the fourth day the middle one, the copper-brown drake, had crept a few feet closer to where Earl stood at the horse stalls. By the fifth day it was sitting at the edge of the nest watching him with its head tilted slightly to one side. But it was the smallest one, the pale gray female, that surprised him. On the sixth morning Earl was standing outside on the porch before sunrise, the way he always did, holding his coffee and watching the dark sky turn slowly pink at the edges. He heard a light sound behind him, turned, and found the small gray drake sitting on the top rail of the fence post to his left. She was facing east, the same direction he was facing, wings folded neatly, tail wrapped around the post. She did not look at him. She just sat there watching the light come up the same way he was watching it. Earl looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the sunrise. They stood that way together until the sun was fully up. Then Earl finished his coffee and went inside to make his breakfast, and when he looked out the window a few minutes later, she was gone. She was back the next morning. And the morning after that. By the end of the second week she was sitting close enough that Earl could have reached out and touched her without stretching. He did not do that. He just stood and drank his coffee and watched the sky, and she sat on the post and did the same thing, and it was a perfectly reasonable arrangement as far as Earl was concerned. It was on a Thursday afternoon that the riders came. Earl heard them before he saw them, hooves on the dry road, more than one horse moving at a steady pace. He came around from the back of the barn where he had been working and saw three men riding up the track toward the house. Two of them he did not know. The third was a man named Gordon who worked in some official capacity for the county, though Earl had never been entirely clear on what that capacity was. Gordon wore a jacket that was too clean for the frontier and an expression that suggested he considered himself more important than most situations warranted. Earl walked to the porch and stood on it. Gordon pulled up his horse at the fence line and called out that there had been reports of dangerous wild creatures on Earl's property and that they had come out to assess the situation and remove the animals if necessary. He used several long words that meant approximately nothing. The two men with him had rifles across their saddles, not raised but present. Earl looked at them. He reached just inside the front door and picked up his own rifle, not raising it, just resting it across his left arm, barrel down. He held his coffee mug in his right hand. He said that there was nothing dangerous on his property. He said they were welcome to take his word for it. He said the road back to town was the same one they had come in on. Gordon started to say something about authority and public safety. Earl took a slow sip of his coffee and looked at him with an expression that was not angry and was not afraid and was not anything in particular, just steady and patient and completely immovable. Gordon stopped talking. The three men looked at each other. Then they turned their horses around and rode back the way they came. Earl watched them go. Then he went back to fixing the fence. Earl did not sleep well that night. He was not a man who spent much time thinking about things he could not change, but the image of those three riders turning their horses around stayed with him longer than he expected. Not because he was afraid of them coming back. He was not. It was something else, something quieter than fear, sitting at the back of his mind like a stone he kept stepping around without looking at directly. The drakes were not safe here. Not truly. Not yet. He was up before dawn the way he always was, boots on and coffee on the stove while the sky outside was still dark. He stood at the window and looked at the barn. The door was closed. No sound, no light, nothing unusual. He drank his coffee and waited for the morning to come. When it was light enough to see clearly, he walked out to the barn and pushed the door open. Something was different. The gray female was not in the nest. The other two were there, the large green one and the copper-brown middle one, both watching him from their usual positions. But the small gray female who had spent the last several mornings sitting beside him on the fence post was standing in the middle of the barn floor, square in the center, not hiding, not pressed against anything. Just standing there facing the door. Facing him. Earl stopped just inside the entrance. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she walked forward, past the halfway point of the barn floor, and kept walking until she reached the barn door and stepped out into the full morning light for the first time since he had found them. She stood in the open air and looked up at him. In the daylight she looked different than she had in the shadows of the barn. Smaller, somehow, but also more real. Her pale gray scales caught the morning light and shifted between silver and white depending on how she moved. Her eyes were a deep amber color, almost gold, and they were very old-looking eyes for something so small. There were thin scars along her left side that Earl had not noticed before, healed over but visible, running in two long lines beneath her wing. She opened her mouth and spoke. The voice that came out was low and rough, like someone had taken gravel and smoke and shaped them into words. It was not loud. It was not practiced. But every word was clear. She told him their mother had been a Highland drake, a large one, old enough to have lived in the upper ridges for many years without ever coming down near people. She had kept them hidden, the three of them, in a den above the tree line where almost nothing ever came. They had been safe. They had been warm. They had been learning how to fly properly and how to hunt small things and how to read the wind for weather. Then the hunters came. Earl said nothing. He stood still and listened. She said the hunters came in a group, 6 of them, with long rifles and wagons built for hauling large animals. They had been tracking her mother for some time, she thought, because they arrived knowing exactly where the den was. Her mother had fought. She had been strong and she had fought hard, but there were 6 of them and only one of her, and the rifles were loud and did not stop. She told them to run before it was over. They ran. The 3 of them had come down from the high country with nothing. No food, no shelter, no direction except away. They had walked for days. They had hidden from people twice on the road, pressing into ditches and brush while wagons rolled past. They had been cold every night and hungry most of the days. Then the smallest one had smelled something in the wind, warm hay, old leather, wood smoke, and they had followed it until they found the barn. She stopped talking. The silence that came after was very large. Earl looked at her standing there in the morning light with her old eyes and her healed scars and her rough voice that had said everything plainly without asking for pity. He looked at the barn behind her where the other 2 were watching from the doorway, the large green one with his head low and the copper-brown one pressed close against his side. Then the barn door shifted slightly and the smallest one came out. He moved slowly, each step careful, legs trembling the way they had trembled the first morning Earl found them under the blankets. He crossed the distance between the barn door and Earl's boots in a long, quiet moment, and then he lowered his head and pressed it gently against the toe of Earl's left boot and stayed there. He did not make a sound. Earl looked down at him for a moment. Then he looked back at the female. She met his eyes directly, the way very few people ever did, and she spoke again. She said they were asking to stay. She said they would cause no trouble and bring no harm to anything on his property. She said they would work for what they ate and take up only what space they were given. She said they understood if the answer was no. But she asked him plainly, without dressing it up in anything extra, because it was all they had left to do. Earl was quiet for a long time. He looked out past the fence at the empty road. He looked at the barn. He looked at the smallest drake still pressed against his boot, not moving, just staying there with his eyes closed like he had already decided this was where he belonged and was simply waiting to find out if the world agreed. Earl reached down and rested 2 fingers briefly on top of the small head. Then he straightened up, turned, and walked back toward the barn. He pushed the door all the way open as he passed it and left it that way. He did not look back. He did not need to. Earl did not ask them to do anything. That was the part that stayed with him later when he thought back on how it all began. He had not given instructions or pointed at tasks or tried to explain what needed doing around the ranch. He had simply gone about his work the way he always did, and the drakes had watched him, and somewhere in that watching they had figured things out for themselves. It started with the horses. Earl had a routine at dusk where he walked the fence line and called the maras in from the far pasture before the light went completely. Roan would come easy, but Dusty had a habit of drifting to the far corner near the creek and staying there past dark, which meant Earl had to walk the full length of the pasture in the fading light to bring her in. He had done it so many times it barely registered as a chore anymore. It was just a thing the evening required. On the fourth day after the drakes had been given the barn properly, Earl walked out at dusk and stopped at the pasture gate. Both horses were already in. He stood there for a moment looking at the empty pasture, then at the two maras standing calmly in the corral, then at the large green drake sitting near the corral fence with his tail wrapped around his feet and an expression that suggested he had simply been sitting there the whole time and had no particular comment on anything. Earl looked at him. The green drake looked back. Earl opened the corral, checked the horses over, found them fine and closed it again. He glanced back at the green drake once more before heading inside. The drake had already turned to look at the pasture, watching the last of the light go down, apparently satisfied with the evening. It happened again the next night. And the night after that. Within a week it was simply the way dusk worked on the ranch. The green drake, whom Earl had taken to calling broad in his own head on account of the width of his shoulders, moved the horses in every evening without being asked and without any fuss. He did not chase them or frighten them. He simply appeared at the far end of the pasture and walked slowly behind them and they came in. Even Dusty came in without her usual argument. Earl suspected Dusty had more sense than she usually let on and had simply been waiting for someone worth listening to. The water troughs were the next thing. October turned hard that year, colder than the last two, and by the second week of the month the night temperatures were dropping low enough to put ice on the troughs by morning. Earl had been breaking ice every dawn for years, a short-handled hammer kept on the hook by the barn door for exactly that purpose. It was not a difficult task but it was a cold one, and on the worst mornings the ice was thick enough to take several good swings. He reached for the hammer one morning and found he did not need it. The troughs were clear. Not just broken up but fully clear, the water sitting open and still and completely unfrozen in air cold enough to make his breath come out in thick clouds. He put his hand near the surface of the nearest trough and felt a faint warmth rising from the water itself. He turned and found the gray female sitting on the fence rail above the trough, watching him with her gold eyes, wings folded. There was the faintest trace of heat still coming off the underside of her jaw. Earl set the hammer back on its hook. He nodded at her once and went to start his morning. She was there every night after that, making her quiet rounds of the troughs in the dark while Earl slept, keeping the water open through the coldest hours. He never saw her do it. He only ever saw the result and the result was always the same. Clear water, every morning no matter how hard the night had frozen. And then there was the smallest one. He had no useful skill that Earl could identify and Earl suspected he knew it. But what he lacked in practical ability he made up for entirely in presence. He followed Earl from the moment Earl stepped outside in the morning to the moment Earl went back inside at night. He rode in the back of the work wagon when Earl drove out to check the far fence. He sat on the top step of the porch when Earl ate lunch outside on warm days. He positioned himself near whatever Earl was working on and watched with an expression of complete and serious attention, as though he were taking notes on the correct way to do everything and planned to be very useful someday. Earl found he did not mind the company. The mountain cat came on a Wednesday night in early November. Earl heard the horses first, a sharp stamp and a high sound from Roan that she only made when something was wrong. He was out of bed and pulling his boots on before he was fully awake, reaching for the rifle he kept beside the door. He crossed the porch in the dark and was halfway to the corral when he saw the flash. A long line of flame hit the ground 10 feet in front of the corral fence, scorching the earth in a clean straight line between the horses and the darkness beyond. The mountain cat, a large one, screamed once and was gone into the brush before Earl had taken 3 more steps. He heard it crashing away through the scrub, moving fast and not stopping. The gray female sat on top of the corral gate, watching the darkness where the cat had gone. She did not look back at Earl. She just watched until she was satisfied it was not returning, then folded her wings and settled. Earl stood in the cold with his rifle in his hands and looked at the scorched line in the dirt. He had not even gotten close. Word did what word always does in quiet country. It moved slowly and without permission from ranch to ranch, from one person's kitchen table to another's, carried by the men who had seen the drakes at the fence line or the travelers who had passed the property on the road and noticed unusual shapes on the rooftop at dusk. Nobody said anything dramatic. There was no story told with any great excitement. It was simply a thing people began to know, the way they knew other plain facts about the region. Old Earl out on the south road had 3 drakes on his ranch. They were working animals. They were not leaving. Earl heard them coming from a long way off. It was the iron cage wagon that made the noise, its wheels heavy and uneven on the dry road, rattling in a way that carried far in the still morning air. Earl was on the porch with his coffee when he first heard it, and he stood there and listened and counted the sounds the way a man does when he has lived alone long enough that his ears have learned to do useful work. One wagon. Several horses. More than 4, less than 10. He set his coffee mug on the porch rail and waited. They came around the bend in the road 7 strong. 6 riders in matching coats that said official business without anyone having to say a word, and one man at the front on a tall gray horse who wore his authority the way some men wore hats that were slightly too big, with great effort and uncertain results. Behind them all was the wagon, iron-barred on all 4 sides, built for something large and meant to stay inside it. The bars were thick. The lock on the door was the size of Earl's fist. Earl looked at the wagon for a long moment. Then he looked at the man on the gray horse. The man introduced himself as a regional inspector by the name of Holt. He had papers, which he produced from his coat with the practiced motion of someone who produced papers often and believed firmly in their power. He rode to the fence line and held them out, and Earl walked down from the porch and took them and read them standing in the road. The papers said that 3 unregistered wild creatures of the Drake classification had been reported on private property in the region. They said that under regional authority such creatures were subject to capture and transfer to a government facility for examination and study. They said the bearer of the writ was authorized to enter the property and carry out the removal by whatever reasonable means were necessary. They used long words to say simple things the way official papers always did. Earl read it to the end. Then he folded it once, neatly, along the center crease, and set it on top of the fence post beside him. He walked to the middle of the road and stopped there and stood still. Holt looked at him from the tall gray horse with an expression that suggested this was not the response the papers usually produced. He said that Earl had read the writ and understood its authority. He said the removal was not optional. He said Earl would be wise to cooperate and allow them access to the property so the matter could be handled quickly and without difficulty for anyone involved. Earl said nothing. Behind him, without any signal that anyone watching could have identified, things shifted. Broad came around the left side of the barn and positioned himself at the corral gate, his large green body settled low and his eyes on the riders with a calm and level attention that was somehow more serious than if he had been snarling. The gray female dropped from the barn roof without a sound and landed on top of the fence rail to Earl's right, folding her wings with slow precision, her gold eyes moving from rider to rider with an expression that was patient and measuring and not afraid of anything she was looking at. And the smallest one came through the barn door, walked across the yard, and climbed Earl's left side with his small claws finding holds in the coat fabric until he reached the shoulder, where he settled himself and flared his wings out to their full span. They were not large wings. He was not a large drake. But he held them as wide and as straight as he possibly could and looked out at the 6 riders and the inspector with an expression of complete and absolute seriousness that Earl, had he been looking, might have found worth smiling at. He was not smiling. But his jaw was a little less tight than it had been a moment before. Holt looked at the drakes. He looked at Earl standing in the road with a small drake on his shoulder and 2 larger ones holding positions behind him. He looked at his 6 riders, who were looking at the drakes with expressions that ranged from uncertain to quietly unwilling to move forward. Holt tried again. He said this was government authority. He said the creatures were unregistered and unclassified and posed a potential risk to the region. He said Earl was one man and the law was larger than one man's opinion of it. He said the cage wagon had been brought specifically because the government took these matters seriously and Earl should do the same. Earl let him finish. Then Earl spoke and his voice was the same voice he always used, low and even and without any heat in it at all. He said the drakes were on private property. He said they had harmed nothing and no one. He said a piece of paper written by people who had never set foot on this land did not give anyone the right to come onto it and take living creatures that had done nothing wrong. He said he had read the writ and he understood what it claimed and he was telling them plainly that they were not coming through that fence. He did not raise his voice. He did not move from the middle of the road. Holt sat on his horse and said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the riders. The riders looked at the drakes. Broad had not moved from the corral gate. The gray female had not moved from the fence rail. The smallest one had not lowered his wings. The silence went on long enough to become its own kind of answer. Holt gathered his papers from the fence post without looking at Earl directly. He said this was not finished and that the matter would be taken up through proper channels and that Earl should expect to hear more on the subject. Then he turned the gray horse around and the 6 riders turned with him and the iron cage wagon rattled back down the road the way it had come, empty and loud and getting quieter with every passing minute until it was gone entirely. Earl stood in the road until the last sound of it faded. Then he turned and walked back to the porch. The smallest drake was still on his shoulder, wings folded now, pressed warm against the side of his neck. Broad had moved away from the corral gate and was grazing along the fence line with complete indifference to everything that had just happened. The gray female followed Earl to the porch and took her place on the rail, facing the road, watching. That evening Earl sat in his chair as the sun went down and the sky turned the color of old copper. The smallest one was asleep in his lap, curled into a shape that took up more room than something that size had any right to, his breathing slow and steady and warm against Earl's hand. Broad stood at the far fence with his back to the house, watching the pasture go dark. The gray female sat on the porch rail and watched the road, the same road the riders had come down that morning, now empty and quiet and going nowhere in particular. Earl looked out at his land. 11 years he had worked it alone. 11 years of quiet mornings and long evenings and the kind of silence that fills a place when there is no one in it but you. He had made his peace with that silence a long time ago. He had told himself it was enough. He looked down at the small drake sleeping in his lap. He looked at the gray female keeping watch without being asked. He looked at Broad standing patient at the fence line as the last light left the sky. Earl picked up his coffee mug from the armrest, found it had gone cold, and drank it anyway. The road stayed empty. The ranch stayed quiet. And for the first time in 11 years the quiet felt full.